Welcome back to the First Presbyterian Church Story Hour, where we're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We have Freddie here. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is written by C.S. Lewis, and we are on chapter 10. So as soon as I get Freddie all settled here with his special treats. Okay, there you go, Freddie. We'll start. The spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves up in their coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up the sacks and laying them down on the table, and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, reach up down there and get that ham, bring it down." I'm sure Freddie would have liked that ham. I'm very sure he would have. And there's a packet of tea, and there's sugar, and some matches. And if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner. "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us to take," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You don't think we'd set out on this journey without something to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute now." "That's what I say," claimed Mr. Beaver. "We must get going." "Get along with that," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for another quarter of an hour at least. But don't we want to have a bigger start as we can get as possible?" said Peter, "if we're to catch and reach the stone table before her." "You've got to remember that," Mrs. Beaver said. "As soon as she looked in here and sees that we are gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her no matter what we do, for she'll be on the sledge and we're walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now, don't get fussing there, dear," Mrs. Beaver said, "but just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer, 'cause we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she will not expect, and perhaps we'll get through to the stone table." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time that we get out of here." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 4 loads, and the smallest of us, that's you, my dear." And she looked down at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Let's go." "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answers Mrs. Beaver, and at last allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "A great deal too heavy to bring. And you don't think you'll be able to use it either while we are out on the run? I do suppose you can't use it." "I can't abide the thought that the witch fiddling around with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it." "Maybe likely not." "Oh, please, 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 please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "We'll give her a bit," he said. And then they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out, and when they began their journey, they went in single file. First was Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, and then Susan, and then Mrs. Beaver was last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and into the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path, along the trees, right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley shining in the moonlight, towering up far above them on either side. Best keep down here as much as possible, he said. She'll have to keep up on the top, for you can't bring a sledge down here. It would be a pretty enough scenery to look at through a window from sitting at a comfortable chair, and even as it were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as the sacks she carried felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. She stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river, with all the waterfalls of ice, and all the white masses on the treetops, and the great glaring moon, and the country, and the countless stars that were in the sky, could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going patty pat through the snow in front of her, as if it was never, ever going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she almost fell asleep as she was walking. At the same time, and then suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right and was leading them steeply down this hill into a very, very thick bush, until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short tail, flat tail, was showing out. Lucy immediately stopped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment, all 5 of them were inside this little cave. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in this darkness. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep. If you hadn't all been in such a plague of a fuss when we were starting, I would have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. That's very thoughtful, that's her, don't you think? I sleep better with a pillow. It wasn't nearly such as nice a place as Mr. Thomas's, Lucy thought, but just a hole in the ground, but it was dry. It was very small, so that when all of them lay down, they were all bundled up together, fur coats together, and they were getting warm from their long walk, and they were really felt rather snug in there. If only the floor of the cave was a little bit more smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed around in a dark little flask, one of which everyone drank something. It made them cough a little bit and sputter a little and stung in their throats. But it also made them feel deliciously warm after you'd swallowed it. And enough, and everyone in a moment went to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only a few moments, though it had really been hours and hours, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would love a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw a cold daylight coming through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and their eyes wide open, listening to a sound, which the very sound they'd all been thinking of, something they had imagined they had heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingle bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought, for a moment, that it was a very silly thing for him to do, but it was really very sensible. One, he knew he could scramble up to the top of the bank among the bushes without being seen, and he wanted above all to see which way the witch was going. The other all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. That could seem a very long time stuck in a cave. Then they heard something that frightened them very, very much. They heard voices. Oh, thought Lucy, he's been seen. She's caught him. Oh, great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them just outside the cave. It's all right, he said. Come out, Mrs. Beaver, come out, sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. It's all right. It is not her. This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk in Narnia when they get excited. In our world, of course, they don't really talk at all now, do they? So Mrs. Beaver and the children came budgeling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, with the earth all covered from them for sleeping in the cave, and they looked frosty and unbrushed and uncombed, and they had sleeping still in their eyes. Come on, cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling. What do you mean, Mr. Beaver? Panted Peter, as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. Didn't I tell you, answered Mr. Beaver, that she made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, come and see. And then they were all at the top, and they did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeer with bells on their harnesses. But they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white, but they were brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew at the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robes, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside of it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talk about even in our world, the world on the other side of the wardrobe. But when you really see them in Narnia, oh, it's rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real, and they all began quite still. They were very glad, but it was also very solemn. I've come at last, he said. She has kept me out for a long time, but I have come at last. Aslan is on the move, and the witch's magic is weakening. And Lucy felt running through her the deep shivers of gladness which only you get when you are being solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it off at your house as I pass." "If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy, "but it's locked up." "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get back home, you will find your dam is finished, and the mending of all the leaks have been fixed, and you'll have a new gate." Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide, and then he found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents. And they are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps nearly at hand. Bear them well." With these words, he handed Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and a cross in it that ramped in a red line, as bright as the ripe strawberries at the moment that you picked them. The tilt of the sword was of gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt, everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." He handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only in great need, for I do not mean you to be in the fights of the battle. It does not quite suit you. And you put this horn to your lips and blow it wherever you are. I think help shall soon come and find you." Last of all, he said, "Lucy, Eve's daughter," and Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterwards that it was made of diamonds. And there was a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of the juice of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends are hurt, a few drops of this will restore you, and the dagger is to defend yourself at great need, for you also are not to be in this battle." "Why, sir," said Lucy, I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough to be in a battle." "That is not the point," he said, "but battles are ugly when women fight. And now," he said suddenly, looking less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose it came from the big bag in his back, but nobody quite saw where it came from. But it was a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump of sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, sizzling and piping hot. He cried out, "A Merry Christmas! Long live the true King!" And he cracked his whip, and the reindeer and the sledge, they were all out of sight before anyone realized that it had even started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of the set and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, "Now then, you know, don't start talking there till the tea gets cold. Just come like men, come and help to carry the tray down, and we shall have some breakfast." What a mercy! I thought of bringing the bread knife. So down the steep bank they went, back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some bread and some ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, "Time to be moving on now." End of chapter 10. And Freddie and I thank you for joining you. We'll see you shortly for chapter 11.